In the winter light outside Milan's Via Palestro offices on 27th of March 1985, the marble steps still held the chill of morning. Inside, secretaries arranged files and straightened silk scarves. Outside, a concierge smoothed on his black leather gloves, a small ritual against the cold. At 8:30 a.m., Maurizio Gucci, last family heir to the Florentine leather dynasty founded by Guccio Gucci, climbed those steps with a portfolio under his arm, pursued as always by the faint click of cameras in gossip columns that had chronicled his life for decades. Across town, in an apartment lined with fashion magazines and cuttings from society pages, Patrizia Reggiani noted the same date in her diary with a single word: paradeisos, paradise. Years earlier, she had been quoted saying she would rather cry in a Rolls Royce than be happy on a bicycle, a line that condensed a lifetime of aspiration into one perfectly polished cruelty. The day would end in gunshots on the stone steps and headlines across the world. But in this quiet opening, we remain with the gesture of a gloved hand on marble, elegance, control, and a cost still hidden beneath cashmere and gold. In the late autumn of 1960, in a modest apartment in Milan's working-class periphery where industrial noise from nearby factories filtered through thin walls and the smell of shared courtyard laundry hung in the air, a teenage Patrizia Martinelli stood before a small mirror propped against a wardrobe, practicing postures she had observed in magazine photographs torn from glossy publications she could not afford to buy. Born in 1948 in the small northern Italian town of Vignola, a place of modest houses and agricultural traditions, she had been raised by her mother Silvana in these cramped Milan rooms where trams ground along Corso Venezia and the smell of cooking from neighboring apartments, garlic, tomatoes, the daily polenta, seeped through thin walls that provided little privacy or separation from the lives of other struggling families. The transformation that would lift them from this world was still ahead. Silvana's marriage to Ferdinando Reggiani, a transport and trucking magnate whose fortune had grown during Italy's post-war economic miracle. That remarkable period from the 1950s through the early 1970s when the country rebuilt its economy through manufacturing, infrastructure development, and export growth. Reggiani's trucking business had expanded with the highway system, moving goods across Italy and into Europe, the kind of practical, unglamorous enterprise that nevertheless generated substantial wealth for those positioned to capitalize on post-war reconstruction. That marriage, when it came, would provide Patrizia not just with wealth, but with a new surname that could be spoken in better neighborhoods, a new social position that opened doors previously closed, and a carefully managed narrative of respectable origins that could be strategically deployed or obscured in future introductions, depending on what the situation required. The transformation would be both material and performative: new address, new clothes, new patterns of speech, a wholesale reconstruction of identity that she had been preparing for without quite knowing it. But in this moment before that elevation, we see her smoothing imaginary gloves over wrists she dreamed would one day be weighted with gold bracelets, her hands moving through gestures copied from women she had only seen in photographs or through the windows of shops on Via Monte Napoleone where she dared not enter. Her movements were deliberate, studied, the physical vocabulary of privilege rehearsed until it might appear natural rather than learned. She practiced the angle at which wealthy women held their hands when gesturing, the way they touched their hair or jewelry, as if adjusting beautiful things was so habitual as to be unconscious. Her mother, Silvana, understanding perhaps better than her daughter the narrow path they were trying to navigate, rehearsed advice about how to speak without revealing provincial vowels, how to dress to suggest innate refinement rather than merely display recently acquired money, how to enter a room as if entitled to occupy the space rather than grateful for admission to it. These lessons were practical survival skills disguised as etiquette, taught in a cramped apartment but aimed at gaining entry to a world of marble foyers and crystal chandeliers. In later profiles published after her mother's remarriage to Reggiani, journalists would describe Patrizia's humble origins, a phrase that simultaneously acknowledged her social rise and reminded readers that her position was achieved rather than inherited, earned through marriage rather than birth, a status that could theoretically be revoked if she failed to maintain the performance. Milanese society pages that would eventually feature her at charity balls and fashion events never quite let that distinction disappear entirely. She would always be the trucking heiress who married into Gucci, never simply a Gucci herself. The narrator observes that the first cost of privilege appears here as expectation, a young girl learning that love, safety, and admiration arrive dressed as money, that affection itself might be a transaction requiring the correct performance, the right costume, the proper staging. She absorbed the lesson that her mother was teaching, perhaps not consciously, but through every interaction, that women without independent wealth must convert their youth, beauty, and social skills into security, that the alternative to successful performance was a return to cramped apartments and limited futures, that everything, absolutely everything, depended on being wanted by someone with resources. Long before she would hire a hitman to eliminate the husband who had stopped wanting her, she was learning to treat relationships as negotiations, where the terms must be constantly managed and the outcome perpetually secured through calculation rather than trust. The gloves she imagined wearing were not merely fashion accessories, but symbols of a life where hands never touched anything rough or unpleasant, where labor was invisible and beauty appeared effortless, where money created a buffer between the self and every ordinary difficulty. On a warm evening in 1970, at a fashionable private club near Via Monte Napoleone in Milan's luxury shopping district, smoke from expensive cigarettes curled beneath crystal chandeliers while waiters in white gloves circulated among guests whose clothing and jewelry announced their belonging to a particular stratum of Italian society. The post-war economic boom had created new fortunes alongside old names, and events like this mixed industrialists with aristocrats, self-made millionaires with inherited titles, fashion entrepreneurs with banking families, creating a social landscape where money could purchase access but full acceptance remained more elusive. The club itself was decorated in the style of the era: plush velvet furniture in jewel tones, gilded mirrors multiplying the candlelight, modernist art on walls that suggested both cultural sophistication and contemporary taste. The soundscape mixed Italian and French, with occasional English spoken by international guests, the multilingual chatter itself a marker of the cosmopolitan world these people inhabited. Perfume and cologne mingled with cigarette smoke, and the scent of expensive flower arrangements refreshed daily. Among the crowd, a camera might glide past tuxedos and floor-length gowns, Valentino, Pucci, emerging designers competing for attention, to find Patrizia, now in her early 20s, transformed by her mother's marriage into Patrizia Reggiani and positioned to move in circles far above her childhood circumstances. She wore a sequined dress that caught light with each movement, the kind of dress that announced both the wearer's beauty and her access to designers and boutiques beyond most people's reach. When she laughed, too loudly perhaps, but with confidence, she adjusted her black evening gloves not from nervousness but to signal a poise she had practiced until it appeared natural, until the performance had become so habitual that it was impossible to separate it from whatever authentic self might exist beneath. At the bar stood Maurizio Gucci, only grandson of Guccio Gucci, who had founded the leather goods company in Florence in 1921, initially as a small shop producing luggage and saddlery for wealthy Florentines, and son of Rodolfo Gucci, a former actor who had transitioned into running the family business after his film career ended. Maurizio himself, 22 years old, handsome in the particular way of wealthy Italian men of that era, well-groomed, expensively dressed, carrying himself with the confidence that comes from never having doubted his position in the world, was heir to a name that had evolved from a Florence luggage shop into a global symbol of Italian luxury, its double G logo recognizable from Rome to New York to Tokyo, its products displayed in flagship stores on the world's most expensive shopping streets. Later interviews and biographical accounts recall that they met at a party during this period, and that Maurizio was immediately struck by Patrizia's resemblance to the Italian actress Gina Lollobrigida, then at the height of her fame as one of Europe's most celebrated beauties. The comparison was both compliment and reduction, acknowledging her attractiveness while simultaneously placing her in a category of women valued primarily for physical appearance rather than for other qualities. Patrizia, accustomed to being looked at and having learned to weaponize her beauty, would have understood the compliment's double edge, but accepted it as useful nevertheless. Society columns from the early 1970s began noting their names appearing together at Milan dinners, art gallery openings, and fashion events, their coupling photographed with increasing frequency as their relationship developed from initial attraction into something more serious and publicly acknowledged. The progression was documented in society pages as if choreographed. First appearances together, then mentions as a couple, then speculation about marriage. Each stage reported and analyzed as if their personal relationship was a matter of public interest and legitimate subject for commentary. In that smoke-filled room, with its chandeliers and expensive perfume, and the particular energy of wealthy people at leisure, Maurizio saw a lure and perhaps an escape from the suffocating expectations of his famous family. A beautiful woman who was interested in him as a person, rather than merely as a Gucci heir, or so he may have wanted to believe. His father Rodolfo, however, saw risk. A woman whose origins were uncertain despite her stepfather's wealth, whose motives might be calculated rather than romantic, whose presence in the family would bring questions about whether she sought the man or the name he carried, whether her affection was genuine or strategic. The narrator reflects that both observations contain truth. Patrizia brought genuine feeling and dangerous ambition, authentic attraction, and strategic calculation, the complexity of a person who had learned that survival required performing roles that could not be separated from whatever authentic self existed beneath them. She was not simply a gold digger, nor was she simply a woman in love. She was both and neither, her motivations as mixed and contradictory as most people's, but operating in a context where the stakes were extraordinarily high and where every choice carried implications that extended far beyond personal happiness. Before she could enter the Gucci palaces, both literal and metaphorical, the first person she had to convince was a Gucci. The courtship that followed would be both genuine romance and calculated campaign, the boundary between the two increasingly difficult to distinguish even for the participants themselves, perhaps especially for them. On 28 October 1972, church bells echoed through Milan's Duomo as Maurizio Gucci and Patrizia Reggiani married despite fierce opposition from Rodolfo Gucci, who had reportedly called her a social climber with nothing in mind but money, and had even attempted to enlist the Archbishop of Milan to block the union through some ecclesiastical intervention that the Archbishop apparently declined to provide. The wedding proceeded nonetheless, celebrated in Milan's most prestigious cathedral, documented in photographs that show Patrizia in white, holding a cascading bouquet of roses and orchids, her dress custom designed, her veil of Brussels lace, every detail calculated to project both traditional bridal innocence and the luxury that the Gucci name represented. Maurizio's gloved hand rests awkwardly over hers in the formal photographs taken on the cathedral steps, his posture suggesting discomfort with the ceremonial aspects of the day, his smile not quite reaching his eyes in images that would later be analyzed for signs of the trouble ahead. The wedding party included members of Milan's elite, business associates of both Reggiani and Gucci families, fashion industry figures, a sprinkling of minor aristocrats whose presence conferred social legitimacy, but notably absent, was Rodolfo himself, who refused to attend his only son's wedding, a snub that was both personal rejection of Patrizia and public statement about his disapproval. Rodolfo's concerns were not simply snobbish prejudice, though that element certainly existed in his dismissal of Patrizia as a social climber. He worried about the family business, about maintaining control over the Gucci brand during a period when it was expanding internationally, but also facing internal family conflicts over direction and ownership. a daughter-in-law whose loyalty was uncertain, whose background provided no useful business connections, whose presence might complicate already tense family dynamics. These were legitimate concerns from his perspective, even if they were also bound up with class prejudice and paternal possessiveness that wanted to control his son's choices. As a belated concession or perhaps an attempt to establish boundaries while acknowledging the inevitable, Rodolfo arranged for the couple to receive a penthouse apartment in Olympic Tower in New York City. The prestigious Fifth Avenue skyscraper completed in 1976 that housed both luxury residences and international corporate offices. Property records confirm this gift, which simultaneously provided generously for his son, while also positioning the newlyweds at a comfortable distance from Milan and from direct daily involvement in the increasingly contentious family business disputes that occupied Rodolfo's attention. The apartment itself was spectacular. High floors with views across Central Park and Manhattan, marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of space that announced its occupant's status simply through square footage and location. The building's amenities included white-glove doorman service, private elevators, and security that ensured residents moved through public spaces without encountering anyone who didn't belong to their economic class. It was a gilded cage, beautiful and comfortable, but also isolating, a residence that simultaneously celebrated and enforced a particular kind of existence. The soundscape shifts as we follow them to New York, the rumble of Manhattan traffic replacing Milan's trams and motor scooters, the clink of champagne glasses at Studio 54 where they appeared among celebrities and fashion insiders during the club's legendary peak years, the bilingual and trilingual chatter at fashion industry events where the Gucci name provided automatic entry to the highest circles and where Patrizia learned to navigate a new social landscape. New York in the mid-1970s was experiencing both financial crisis and cultural explosion, the city's near bankruptcy coinciding with extraordinary creativity in fashion, music, and art, creating a context where old money mixed with new celebrities, where European luxury brands competed for American market share. Patrizia adapted to this new environment with apparent ease, joining New York society's charity circuit and cultivating relationships with prominent figures, including, according to multiple sources, a documented friendship with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, herself a symbol of carefully curated elegance and the private costs that public performance exacts. The friendship, if that's the right word for the relationship between two women whose lives were so thoroughly performed, was noted in society columns and later memoirs, positioning Patrizia as someone who had achieved acceptance at the highest levels of international society. In photographs from this period, Patrizia appears increasingly polished, her earlier tendency toward excessive display refined into something more sophisticated under the influence of New York's particular brand of understated elegance. Her gloves were now exclusively Gucci leather, her jewelry more carefully selected for subtlety rather than impact, her presentation calibrated to signal belonging rather than aspiration. She had achieved what she sought: marriage into a globally recognized name, access to wealth and status, a position in international society that far exceeded anything her childhood circumstances might have predicted. But the achievement came at a price: Rodolfo's continuing disapproval and the family tensions that would only intensify. Her growing understanding that her position was always conditional and subject to challenge, and the beginning of her education in how corporate dynasties function when billions of dollars and generational legacies are at stake. In the society columns, the marriage appeared as a fairy tale of beauty and wealth perfectly united. In the family's private files and legal documents that would later emerge during various business disputes, it read more like a hostile takeover, an infiltration of the family fortress by someone whose loyalties remained forever suspect to those born inside its walls. By the mid-1970s, established in the Olympic Tower penthouse overlooking Fifth Avenue and Central Park, with views that stretched across Manhattan's skyline, Patrizia moved through daily rituals that constituted a kind of informal but rigorous education in corporate wifehood. Morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows onto marble floors as she performed small ceremonies of preparation that structured her days, sliding on Gucci leather gloves before going out, the soft leather fitting perfectly over hands she kept carefully manicured, checking the day's invitations arranged on a silver tray by household staff, each envelope representing an obligation or opportunity that required strategic assessment. Writing thank you notes on heavy monogram stationery, her handwriting carefully controlled to project both warmth and formality, each note a small performance of gracious appreciation. The role she inhabited, wife of a Gucci heir, fixture on the New York social scene, representative of Italian luxury in American high society, required constant performance and strategic thinking. Corporate wives in this milieu functioned as informal diplomats, their charm and social connections serving business purposes even when business was never explicitly discussed. Charity committee meetings provided opportunities to cultivate relationships with other powerful families, Rockefellers, Astors, newer entertainment and real estate fortunes, connections that could prove useful in various contexts. Benefit galas showcased the Gucci name and its association with elegance, each photograph in society pages functioning as unpaid advertising for the brand. Dinners that appeared purely social often carried strategic purpose, strengthening alliances within the luxury goods industry's interconnected networks or managing tensions between competing houses. Press photographs from this era document Patrizia at New York fashion events and charity functions, the Metropolitan Museum's Costume Institute galas, Lincoln Center benefits, private showings at galleries and auction houses, invariably described in captions as elegant, impeccably dressed, and socially adept. Gucci corporate histories note the company's American expansion during this period, with flagship stores opening and market share growing steadily. And while Patrizia held no official role in the business, her presence in society pages provided a kind of ambient marketing. The Gucci name associated with her beauty, her social success, her embodiment of the lifestyle the brand promised to its customers. Unlike the 19th century finishing schools that had once prepared aristocratic women for their roles through formal curricula in languages, music, and deportment, institutions like Miss Porter's or Swiss academies where girls spent years learning to move through aristocratic society, Patrizia's training was on-the-job learning, absorbed through observation and experience rather than explicit instruction. Yet the curriculum remained remarkably similar. Mastering multiple languages, she became fluent in English to navigate New York society, maintained her Italian, and acquired some French for European travel, perfecting physical presentation to ensure she photographed well from every angle and in every light, learning the art of conversation that engaged without alienating, how to show interest without appearing ingratiating, how to demonstrate knowledge without seeming to compete, and understanding how to be watched. This last skill was perhaps the most crucial and the most difficult to master, how to move through rooms knowing that every gesture might be observed and interpreted, that her performance reflected not just on herself, but on the Gucci name she carried through marriage, that she was simultaneously person and symbol, individual and representative. She learned to be conscious of her posture at all times, to control her facial expressions even when tired or bored, to maintain the appearance of effortless grace through events that often lasted hours and required sustained performance. The narrator observes that refinement in the late 20th century was no longer taught primarily in convent schools and Swiss finishing academies, but was instead rehearsed in front of magazine photographers and television cameras. The lessons delivered through society pages that showed which women succeeded in commanding attention and which failed to register. Every photograph in which Patrizia appeared became both documentation of her success and instruction in how to maintain it, the correct angle to hold herself for cameras, three-quarters view, chin slightly lifted, shoulders back but not tense, the jewelry that enhanced rather than overwhelmed, significant pieces but never so many that the image became cluttered, the smile that suggested confidence without arrogance, teeth showing but not too widely, eyes engaged rather than distant. Each posed photograph doubled as a lesson in how to hold power without ever appearing to grasp for it, how to benefit from wealth without seeming to calculate its value, how to be both ornament and operator, simultaneously decorative and strategic. The gloves she wore in these images were not merely fashion accessories, but signatures, markers of her understanding that luxury goods were never just objects, but symbols whose meanings had to be carefully managed, and whose display communicated messages about status, taste, and belonging. In the apartment late at night, after returning from events where she had performed flawlessly for hours, she would remove those gloves with care, placing them in drawers, lined with tissue paper, each pair maintained and stored according to systems that ensured nothing was damaged or lost. The ritual of glove removal marked the transition from public performance to private self, though by this point in her life, the boundary between the two had become so blurred that it was unclear whether any private self remained that was not also performing, whether the woman alone in her bedroom, removing her gloves, was any more authentic than the woman who had worn them to the gala. In 1976, Patrizia gave birth to her first daughter, Alessandra, in a discreet private clinic in New York, where wealthy women delivered babies in conditions more resembling luxury hotel suites than hospital wards. 5 years later, in 1981, a second daughter, Allegra, was born. This time in Milan, as the family's center of gravity had shifted back to Italy, with Maurizio's increasing involvement in family business affairs. Contemporary press coverage and later biographical accounts document these births through the lens of dynasty. Society page announcements emphasize the continuation of the Gucci line, the addition of potential heiresses to the family fortune, the photogenic image of a beautiful mother with beautiful children that magazines preferred over more complicated narratives. In images from this period carefully selected for publication, the young girls appear in perfectly tailored coats. Gucci, naturally, their small bodies already serving as advertisements for the family brand, holding their mother's gloved hand as they exit limousines for ballet lessons or enter fashionable restaurants for family lunches. The photographs project an image of perfect family life: wealthy parents, beautiful children, everyone impeccably dressed, and moving through environments designed for comfort and luxury. Press captions noted the children's beauty, their resemblance to their mother, their embodiment of the Gucci aesthetic, elegance, refinement, the visual vocabulary of privilege. Private legal files that would later become public record during various business disputes and eventually during Patrizia's murder trial documented the more prosaic arrangements behind this elegant image: custody agreements anticipating possible divorce, trust fund structures designed to protect inherited wealth from taxation and potential creditors, schooling decisions that balanced educational quality with social positioning, and the complex financial architecture designed to both provide generously for children and protect family assets across generations from various threats. The children were born into a narrative already written for them, their names embossed on leather goods and corporate documents long before they could write those names themselves or understand what the name Gucci meant beyond their immediate family. In the world of late 20th century luxury dynasties, children inherited not landed estates in the traditional aristocratic sense, though the family did own properties, but rather shares in corporations, brand associations, legal entanglements with relatives fighting over control, and the constant public attention that follows famous names. They would grow up in the gap between the glamour their surname projected to strangers and the family tensions that same surname concealed from public view. Patrizia's role as mother was documented primarily through the same lens that captured all her other performances. In photographs where she appeared with daughters at fashion events or charity functions, in society columns noting family appearances at seasonal galas, in the visual record that showed her managing motherhood as another aspect of her public presentation. What occurred in private moments away from cameras, the actual texture of her relationship with her daughters, the emotional dynamics of their home life when doors were closed and cameras absent, the ways that corporate pressures and marital tensions affected the children's psychological development, remains largely undocumented except through later testimony that emerged during the murder trial and in authorized biographies that present competing narratives shaped by their authors' access and biases. Multiple accounts suggest that Patrizia was an attentive, if controlling mother, deeply invested in her daughter's appearance and social positioning, but perhaps less attuned to their emotional needs. replicating with them some of the same patterns she had learned from her own mother, that love expresses itself through provision of material comfort and social opportunity rather than through emotional availability or unconditional acceptance. She ensured they were beautifully dressed, properly educated in prestigious schools, introduced to the right social circles, but whether she provided emotional intimacy or encouraged their authentic self expression remains unclear from the available evidence. The narrator reflects that in old European aristocracies, heirs inherited entailed estates and titles whose meanings had been established across centuries of tradition, the responsibilities and privileges clearly defined through legal structures refined over generations. In late 20th century luxury dynasties, children inherited something more volatile and less clearly defined: shares in companies whose value fluctuated with market conditions, creative director appointments, and the vagaries of fashion trends, brand associations that could be assets or burdens depending on public perception and family behavior, and legal structures so complex that understanding one's actual inheritance required teams of international lawyers fluent in multiple jurisdictions. The girls born to Patrizia and Maurizio would spend their lives navigating the gap between what the name Gucci meant to strangers: luxury, elegance, Italian craftsmanship, and what it meant within the family itself: conflict, lawsuits, eventually murder. As the family expanded in Augean photographs appearing in magazines and society pages with increasing frequency, the emotional corridors available for genuine relationship and unperformed intimacy seemed to narrow proportionally. The more successful the public presentation, the more perfect the family image, the more difficult it became to determine what, if anything, existed behind that carefully maintained facade. With Rodolfo Gucci's death in May 1983, Maurizio inherited his father's 50% stake in the company and immediately entered a protracted, bitter legal battle with his uncle Aldo Gucci for control of the family business. The soundscape of their lives shifted dramatically from the clink of champagne glasses at social events to the rustle of legal papers in conference rooms, the measured tones of translators during depositions conducted across multiple languages and jurisdictions, the scratch of expensive Mont Blanc fountain pens signing agreements worth millions of lire, the low conversations between lawyers in corridors outside courtrooms. Corporate histories document the complexity and viciousness of this period. Aldo Gucci, who had been instrumental in building Gucci's American presence through his work establishing stores and cultivating celebrity customers, faced tax evasion charges that would result in his conviction and a brief prison sentence, a prosecution that some family members believed Maurizio had encouraged or facilitated through providing information to authorities. Maurizio, advised by expensive lawyers and financial consultants whose fees consumed enormous resources, maneuvered systematically to consolidate control over Guccio Gucci's PA, eventually succeeding in pushing Aldo out, but at enormous legal cost and with lasting family bitterness that would never heal. The battle was fought through proxies and legal documents, shareholder meetings where voting rights determined outcomes, injunctions filed in Italian and American courts, forensic accounting investigations into decades of business records, negotiations over valuations of assets that different parties assessed very differently depending on their interests. By 1986, Maurizio had achieved majority control, but the victory was hollow in many respects. Legal fees had consumed millions, family relationships were destroyed beyond repair, and the company itself was weakened by years of internal conflict that had distracted from business operations and strategic planning. In 1988, facing mounting financial pressures from both the legal costs of the family battle and underlying business challenges as Gucci struggled with changing fashion trends and increased competition, Maurizio sold nearly half of the company to InvestCorp, a Bahrain-based investment firm, for approximately $150 million. The sale marked the beginning of the end of family control over the company that bore their name, though Maurizio retained a significant stake and operational control temporarily. The decision was controversial even among those who had supported him in the battle against Aldo. Selling to outside investors represented a fundamental break with the family business model that had prevailed for decades. Through these corporate battles and business crises, Patrizia watched with intense interest and involvement. Later accounts from people who knew the couple during this period suggest that she was not merely a passive observer decorating business dinners, but deeply engaged with strategy and decision making, sometimes more focused on corporate matters than Maurizio himself, who friends described as increasingly distracted and overwhelmed by the pressures he faced. She positioned herself as advisor, critic, and unofficial partner in business decisions, her opinions carrying weight even when she held no formal position in the company and no legal authority to make decisions. Some accounts suggest she pushed Maurizio toward more aggressive tactics in the battle with Aldo, believing that controlling the company fully justified whatever ruthless methods were necessary. Others indicate she focused particularly on financial implications, constantly calculating what various outcomes would mean for their personal wealth and status, viewing the business conflict through the lens of how it affected her security, rather than considering broader implications for the brand or company employees. The education she received during this period was in the machinery of corporate power and family warfare, how families fought not with physical weapons but with legal documents and financial instruments, how control was asserted through share structures and voting rights rather than through personal authority, how wealth could be both protected and attacked through careful manipulation of legal frameworks and accounting practices. She learned that in this world, family provided no protection. Indeed, family was often the primary battlefield, with the most vicious conflicts occurring between people who shared names and blood, and that wealth required constant vigilance and defense against relatives as much as against external threats. For Patrizia, watching Maurizio struggle with his uncle and observing the terms of eventual settlements and buyouts, the lesson was stark and clear. Her own position and security depended entirely on her marriage to Maurizio, and that security was therefore only as stable as the relationship itself. Should that relationship end through divorce, she would face the same kind of legal and financial calculations she was watching play out between Maurizio and Aldo, but without the protection of the Gucci surname that she held only through marriage, and without the business experience and legal sophistication to navigate such conflicts effectively on her own. The narrator observes that while the men fought in boardrooms and courtrooms, deploying lawyers and accountants and forensic investigators in their battles, she studied the terms and mechanisms of their warfare, the settlement amounts, the ongoing financial obligations, the various legal structures through which money and power were transferred or protected. These were lessons she would later attempt to apply in her own circumstances, though with strategies that would prove far more destructive than any corporate legal battle, crossing from the realm of financial conflict into the territory of criminal violence. In the late 1980s, as Maurizio struggled to manage a company bleeding cash from operational losses, the enormous debt service required by his leveraged buyouts of family shares, and his own questionable business decisions as he attempted to reposition the brand, the couple's personal spending continued at a level that seemed to ignore or deny financial reality. We follow Patrizia through Milan's most exclusive fur salons on Via della Spiga and jewelry ateliers where pieces cost more than most people earned in years, the microphone capturing the whisper of sable against silk lining, the soft click of her heels on marble showroom floors polished to mirror brightness, the murmured consultations with sales staff who knew her by name and understood that nothing needed to be priced aloud. The amounts would simply appear on monthly statements sent to Maurizio's increasingly alarmed accountants. Press reports and later biographical accounts describe expenditure that seemed almost willfully extravagant given the company's precarious financial position. Renovations to multiple residences that consume millions, art purchases from major galleries and auction houses, jewelry acquisitions from Cartier and Bulgari, custom couture clothing in quantities that could never be worn even if she attended events every day, expensive vacations to St. Moritz and Stade, where the family rented entire chalets for weeks at a time. Maurizio's own spending extended to elaborate renovations of company headquarters in Milan and Florence, costly advertising campaigns that failed to produce corresponding revenue increases, and personal items like cars and boats that seemed designed more to project success than to serve practical purposes. For Patrizia, spending functioned as more than mere consumption or the satisfaction of acquiring beautiful things. In her world, objects were never simply objects to be used and enjoyed. A fur coat was armor, announcing her position in social hierarchies, protection against the vulnerability she feared. A diamond bracelet was a declaration of permanent status, evidence that she belonged to the highest tier and could not be easily dislodged. Gloves were signatures marking every gesture as belonging to someone who mattered, whose presence registered in rooms. The objects she accumulated served as proof of her security, visible evidence that she remained protected by wealth and therefore by the social position that wealth conferred. When financial advisors hired by increasingly concerned trustees and bank representatives suggested restraint, she reportedly dismissed their concerns with contempt, viewing cutbacks as admissions of weakness that would undermine her carefully constructed social position. To reduce spending, to scale back display, to economize in ways that might be visible to others in her social circle. These would signal that her position was weakening, that the fortress of luxury she had worked so hard to enter and maintain might be temporary rather than permanent, that she might be vulnerable to the same kind of fall that had defined her early childhood. The often quoted line attributed to her from this period, that she would rather cry in a Rolls Royce than be happy on a bicycle, was reportedly captured by Italian television during an interview or social event and subsequently repeated in print media, becoming the most famous summary of her worldview and values. Whether she actually spoke exactly these words, or whether they were paraphrased or even invented by journalists seeking a pithy quote, matters less than the fact that the sentiment accurately captured how she was perceived by others and perhaps how she understood her own values and priorities. Wealth was not simply preferable to poverty, but constituted the only acceptable condition for existence. Tears shed in luxury being literally preferable to happiness experienced in modest circumstances. The line reveals a worldview in which material conditions supersede emotional states, where the setting matters more than the feeling, where visible status trumps invisible contentment. It suggests someone who has internalized the lesson that security comes only through wealth, and that emotional well-being without financial protection is worthless, that poverty, or even modest comfort, renders any happiness fragile and ultimately meaningless because it can be taken away by economic forces beyond one's control. The narrator reflects that in Patrizia's understanding, forged through her childhood experience of material insecurity and her adult achievement of luxury through marriage, objects served as proof of safety, visible evidence that she remained protected and that her position could not be easily challenged or revoked. Her wardrobe became the most visible balance sheet of what she believed the Gucci name should provide. Not merely comfort or even luxury, but extravagant, conspicuous, irrefutable proof of belonging to the highest tier of European society. Evidence that she had permanently transcended her origins and could never be forced back into the modest circumstances from which she had emerged. As the company's financial situation deteriorated through the late 1980s and early 1990s, with losses mounting and creditors becoming increasingly aggressive, this conflict between appearance and reality intensified into crisis. Maurizio was attempting to save a company through restructuring and cost-cutting, while simultaneously maintaining personal spending that suggested limitless resources and unshakable confidence. Patrizia was defending a lifestyle that represented her entire identity and sense of security, while facing increasing hints that it might be unsustainable, that the foundation on which she had built her life might be eroding despite her desperate efforts to maintain the facade of permanence and invulnerability. By the mid-1980s, Maurizio was increasingly absent from the marriage, his time consumed by business crises that required his constant attention, and, as would later become clear through press reports and testimony during the murder trial, by a developing relationship with Paola Franchi, an interior designer and decorator who represented in many ways everything Patrizia was not. Discreet rather than flamboyant in her personal presentation, professionally accomplished in her own right with an established career independent of any man. from a well-established Milanese family that required no social performance or strategic positioning to justify her presence in elite circles. In 1985, Maurizio left Patrizia, though the formal legal divorce would not be finalized until several years later due to the complexity of property divisions and the Italian legal system's requirements for separating couples with significant assets. The separation marked a watershed in Patrizia's life, the loss of the central role around which she had organized her entire adult identity, the position of Maurizio's wife that had provided her social standing, financial security, and sense of purpose. Press photographs from this period document the visible shift in Maurizio's public presentation. He appeared increasingly at fashion events, gallery openings, and social functions with Paola beside him, the two of them photographed at galas and restaurant openings, their relationship becoming an acknowledged fact in Milan society despite the lack of formal marriage. The images show them as a compatible couple, both attractive, both professionally engaged in creative industries, both moving with ease through social contexts that Maurizio had inhabited since birth and that Paola had known through her family background. Patrizia, meanwhile, appeared in photographs alone, or accompanied only by her daughters Alessandra and Allegra, her isolation visible in images where she maintained her careful grooming and expensive clothing, but where her expression suggested the strain of performing elegance while abandoned, of maintaining the facade of confidence while experiencing rejection. The contrast between her solitary appearances and Maurizio's coupled presence with Paola must have been particularly painful, each photograph in society pages functioning as public documentation of her displacement, evidence that she had been replaced and that her carefully constructed position had been revoked despite her perfect execution of every expected role. The etiquette and social training Patrizia had mastered since her teenage years, how to be the wife, the hostess, the beautiful accessory to a powerful man, the performer of grace and elegance that reflected well on her husband, provided no script for being the discarded wife, the abandoned woman whose position had been revoked despite her flawless performance. She had done everything correctly by the standards of her world, maintained her appearance through expensive grooming and designer clothing, hosted appropriately when required, produced two healthy daughters who could serve as heirs, performed the part of Gucci wife without any visible failure. Yet she discovered that perfect performance guaranteed nothing, that her position was always conditional on Maurizio's continued desire for her presence, always subject to his decisions, rather than secured by her own efforts or achievements. During this period of separation and emotional crisis, Patrizia underwent surgery for a brain tumor discovered through medical investigations prompted by headaches and other symptoms. Hospital records document the surgery, performed in 1992, and the tumor's removal. She would subsequently claim in testimony during her murder trial that this tumor and its treatment had altered her personality fundamentally, contributing to the rage and impaired judgment that led to her later decision to arrange Maurizio's murder. Medical experts consulted during legal proceedings expressed skepticism about this claim. While brain tumors and their treatment can certainly affect personality and judgment, the specific causal link she asserted between the tumor and her decision to hire a hitman was difficult to prove or disprove scientifically, and critics suggested the medical explanation served primarily to provide potential mitigation for premeditated actions that reflected her character, rather than neurological damage. What remains clearly documented, regardless of the tumor's effects, is the intensity of her fury at being abandoned, visible in later testimony and in reported conversations with friends and acquaintances during this period. People who knew her described obsessive focus on Maurizio and Paola, an inability or refusal to accept that the marriage was truly finished and that Maurizio would not return to her, and a conviction that she was entitled by right to a particular standard of living and social position that the divorce threatened to undermine, despite the substantial financial settlement she received. The narrator observes that for someone who had understood relationships as performances that could be perfected through correct execution, abandonment must have felt like a fundamental betrayal of the rules by which she had organized her entire life since adolescence. She had played her part flawlessly according to the script she had learned. Maurizio's departure suggested that the game was rigged, that performance alone could not guarantee security, that everything she had worked to achieve since her modest childhood could be taken away by a man's simple decision to leave, regardless of how perfectly she had fulfilled every expectation. For the first time since her marriage in 1972, when she pulled on her black leather gloves before going out into Milan streets, there was no husband's arm to take, no partnership to perform, no role to play except that of an abandoned wife. The gloves still signaled elegance and status, still marked her as someone who understood luxury and refinement, but they now concealed hands that had nothing to hold, reaching for a position that was slipping away despite her tightening grip. Between 1992 and 1994, Patrizia moved through quieter, fluorescent-lit offices where lawyers explained the arithmetic of divorce with the clinical precision that legal professionals bring to matters that clients experience as emotional catastrophes. Property divisions carefully calculated according to Italian law's formulas for dividing marital assets, custody arrangements for daughters who would split time between parents according to schedules determined more by legal precedent than by the girl's preferences, and alimony payments designed to provide for her ongoing support at a level deemed appropriate given the lifestyle she had maintained during the marriage. The final settlement reportedly granted her approximately $1 million annually in alimony. The exact figure varies slightly across different sources, and the actual amount may have been denominated in Italian lire and subject to currency fluctuations, a sum that most people would consider extraordinarily generous, placing her among the wealthiest divorced women in Italy. But Patrizia allegedly dismissed this amount with contempt as a bowl of lentils, a pittance barely enough to sustain her, an insult after what she had contributed to building the Gucci name's social prestige, and after the years she had devoted to performing the role of Maurizio's wife. Italian divorce law in high-net-worth cases creates ongoing financial relationships between ex-spouses that can last indefinitely, particularly when children are involved and when the wealth being divided is substantial and includes ongoing business interests rather than simply fixed assets. The legal documents binding Patrizia and Maurizio in their post-divorce relationship detailed not just immediate property transfers and division of assets accumulated during the marriage, but continuing obligations that would persist for years, annual alimony payments subject to adjustment for inflation, provisions for the daughter's education and living expenses, arrangements for property use, and crucially from Patrizia's perspective, clauses specifying what would happen if Maurizio remarried. This last set of provisions became central to what followed, occupying her thoughts and shaping her decisions in ways that the murder trial would later expose. Trial testimony revealed that Patrizia feared a potential remarriage between Maurizio and Paola Franchi, believing that such a marriage might reduce her alimony by half or alter other financial arrangements in ways that would fundamentally undermine her lifestyle and financial security. Whether this fear was legally grounded, whether Italian divorce law would actually have reduced her payments if Maurizio remarried, or whether it represented a misunderstanding of the divorce agreement's actual terms, remains somewhat unclear. Lawyers consulted by journalists after the murder expressed differing opinions about what would have actually occurred, some suggesting her payments would have been unaffected, while others indicated that certain provisions might indeed have changed with a remarriage. But regardless of the legal reality, Patrizia's belief in this threat became a driving force in her subsequent actions, transforming from abstract worry into obsessive focus that colored every decision. Prosecutors during her murder trial would emphasize this financial motive relentlessly, that she hired a hitman not solely from passion or jealousy or wounded pride, though those emotions certainly existed, but from calculated concern about money and the lifestyle it sustained. They argued that beneath the emotional language of betrayal and abandonment, beneath the theatrical expressions of hurt feelings and damaged love, lay a businesslike assessment that Maurizio, alive and potentially remarried, represented an unacceptable financial threat, while Maurizio dead meant inheritance for their daughters and therefore continued indirect access to the Gucci fortune through her daughter's wealth. The narrator reflects that the marriage was legally over, dissolved by courts and documented in settlement agreements that had been negotiated and signed, but the financial tether remained, invisible to casual observers but very real in its effects, connecting her ongoing lifestyle and social position to Maurizio's continued existence and specific circumstances. She had lost the social position and daily reality of being Maurizio's wife, the automatic invitations that had come with that role, the deference that the Gucci name had provided when she carried it through active marriage rather than merely through divorce settlement. What remained was the money flowing from his accounts to hers according to legal obligation, and that money was now subject to legal documents whose terms she may not have fully understood, but whose threats she felt with acute intensity. She had spent her adult life learning to navigate social hierarchies through performance and appearance, learning to understand relationships as transactions that could be managed through correct behavior and strategic thinking. Now she faced a legal and financial situation that required different expertise, understanding complex contracts and legal structures, calculating long-term financial security across various scenarios, navigating Italian divorce and inheritance law with its particular provisions and historical precedents, and she was discovering that the skills she had mastered so thoroughly were insufficient for this new challenge. The gloves she wore to meetings with lawyers in those fluorescent-lit offices were still elegant, still expensive Gucci leather, still perfectly maintained and replaced at the first sign of wear. But they could not conceal the desperation of someone whose entire identity was built on wealth she controlled only through contingent legal arrangements that could be altered by circumstances beyond her control. Someone who had learned early that security came only through money, but who had never learned how to generate or protect that money independent of attachment to a wealthy man. Between 1993 and 1994, in the dim back rooms of Milan cafes where afternoon light filtered through tobacco-stained curtains and the air hung heavy with cigarette smoke and the bitter smell of espresso, and in Patrizia's own apartment where fashion magazines and newspaper clippings about Maurizio and Paola covered available surfaces, evidence of her obsessive focus on the couple's activities, Patrizia confided increasingly dark thoughts to Giuseppina Pina Ariema, a self-styled psychic and tarot reader who moved on the margins of respectable society, known in certain circles for providing spiritual guidance, but also for various schemes that operated in legal gray areas. Trial records and later investigative journalism reconstructing the conspiracy would describe Ariema as the crucial intermediary who transformed Patrizia's rage and fantasies of revenge into actual action, connecting her to Benedetto Ciraulo, a debt-ridden pizzeria owner desperate enough for money to accept a murder contract despite no prior history of violence, and to Ivano Savioni, a hotel porter who served as go-between and facilitator in the arrangements. The conspiracy that emerged was improvised and amateurish in many ways, lacking the sophistication of professional criminal operations, but nevertheless functional enough to accomplish its deadly purpose. The actual conversations between these conspirators were partially captured through police wiretaps installed after the murder as investigators built their case by monitoring the participants they had identified through forensic evidence and witness statements, and later reconstructed through testimony during the trial when various participants provided accounts of what had been discussed and planned. Within legal and ethical limits that prevent reproduction of privileged testimony or potentially prejudicial material, we can understand that the conversations progressed from fantasy toward concrete planning, discussions of method. The murder should be quick and clean, accomplished in a way that appeared random rather than targeted. Of opportunity, Maurizio maintained predictable routines that made targeting him relatively straightforward, and of payment, hundreds of thousands of liar-changing hands in cash transactions that were intended to leave minimal paper trail, but that nevertheless created evidence through the movement of money and the necessities of spending it. Patrizia's language in these conversations, as reported in trial coverage and in accounts by investigators who reviewed the evidence, mixed wounded emotional effect with businesslike calculation. She spoke of Maurizio's betrayal in language that emphasized personal hurt, how he had abandoned her, despite her devotion, how Paola had stolen what was rightfully hers, how the divorce had robbed her of position and dignity. But beneath this emotional language ran practical concerns focused on financial implications, ensuring that the death would appear random, rather than targeted, so that she would not be an obvious suspect, verifying that she would have an alibi, placing her far from the scene at the time of the killing, calculating how quickly after Maurizio's death the money would flow to their daughters and therefore become accessible to her through her influence over them. The narrator observes that the social arts Patrizia had learned and perfected across decades: persuasion deployed through charm, the ability to pressure people while appearing only to request favors, the manipulation of relationships to serve strategic purposes, were now turned toward a different and far darker kind of negotiation. Where finishing schools and informal social training had once taught women to secure alliances through proper performance of refinement and to advance their interests through socially acceptable means, she now sought a final, irreversible solution to the problem of Maurizio's continued existence. A contract that would permanently resolve her financial anxieties and restore her sense of security. The same skills that had once been deployed to charm potential business contacts at corporate dinners and navigate Milan society's complex hierarchies were repurposed for conspiracy, building trust with accomplices through apparent intimacy and shared grievance, maintaining their commitment to the plan through a combination of payment and emotional manipulation, managing the complex logistics of murder for hire despite having no prior experience with criminal activity or violence. In one detail reported during trial testimony, she allegedly discussed wanting the killing to be neat and professional, something that would not create unnecessary scandal beyond what was inevitable when a prominent person died violently. The gloves motif returns here in a metaphorical echo. Her desire for a solution that appeared controlled, elegant even in its violence, as if murder itself could be executed with the same attention to appearance and propriety that governed every other aspect of her public presentation. She wanted Maurizio removed from her life and from the threat he represented to her financial security, but she wanted it done in a way that maintained certain standards, that did not make her appear desperate or crude, that could be managed and controlled like the social performances she had mastered. The plan that emerged from these conversations over months of increasingly specific discussion was simple in outline. Hire a gunman through intermediaries that provided some distance from direct contact, provide information about Maurizio's daily routine and the optimal location for the attack, pay in cash distributed through the network of accomplices to minimize direct connections, and ensure that, on the day of the killing, she would be far from the scene with witnesses who could confirm her presence elsewhere. What she failed to calculate with sufficient care was that every conspiracy creates its own evidence, that each additional person involved multiplies the risk of exposure exponentially, and that murder in Milan's wealthy central neighborhoods receives investigative attention that eventually traces every connection, no matter how carefully obscured. On the morning of 27 March 1995, we return to the scene that opened this narrative. Marble steps at the Via Palestro office building still holding the night's chill as morning sun began warming the stone. Secretaries inside arranging files and preparing for the day's work. A concierge outside smoothing his black leather gloves against the cold in a small ritual that marked the transition from personal time to professional role. At approximately 8:30 a.m., Maurizio Gucci arrived at his office building as he did most mornings, climbing the stone steps with his usual portfolio under his arm containing business documents and correspondence, unaware that Benedetto Ciraulo was positioned nearby with a handgun, waiting for the moment when Maurizio would be most vulnerable. What followed was captured in witness testimony from people who saw or heard the attack, in forensic evidence meticulously documented by police investigators, and in physical traces that told a story of violence enacted in seconds. Ciraulo stepped forward as Maurizio reached the building's entrance, firing 3 shots into his back at close range as Maurizio turned or began to fall, then delivering a final shot into his head as he lay on the ground, ensuring death. The building's doorman, Giuseppe Onorato, attempted to intervene in those chaotic seconds and was shot in the arm, sustaining serious injury, but surviving. Maurizio died almost immediately on the marble steps where he had walked thousands of times, his blood pooling on stone that had been cold and clean moments before. Contemporary crime scene photographs, published in Italian newspapers within hours and later reproduced in international coverage that spread the story around the world, showed the portfolio lying near his body, business papers scattered across the steps, the careful order of his morning routine, violently disrupted in seconds by premeditated murder. The killing's location, a prosperous office building in central Milan in broad daylight with numerous potential witnesses, ensured maximum publicity and immediate intensive investigation. Police arrived within minutes of the first emergency calls, sealing the crime scene and beginning the forensic work that would eventually connect the murder to Patrizia through the network of accomplices, each of whom left traces that investigators could follow. Across town in her apartment, at almost precisely the time Maurizio was shot, Patrizia wrote a single word in her diary, paradeisos, the Greek word for paradise. This entry, discovered later by investigators who seized her personal effects during the investigation and presented as evidence during her trial, became one of the most damning pieces of evidence against her. A documented expression of satisfaction on the very day her ex-husband was murdered, suggesting not just prior knowledge but celebration of the outcome, indicating premeditation and a state of mind utterly inconsistent with innocence or even with acceptable emotional response to violent death. The narrator allows this word to hang in the silence without immediate commentary, letting readers absorb its implications, that she had planned sufficiently to know in advance which day Maurizio would die, that she felt not horror or shock or even complicated grief but triumph and relief, that the paradise she sought was not reunion with Maurizio or reconciliation, but rather his permanent absence from the world, his elimination as a threat to her financial security and as a source of emotional torment. The diary entry exposes the emotional reality beneath her later claims that she was manipulated, or that she didn't fully understand what would happen. She knew, she anticipated it, and she welcomed it as paradise. In the space of seconds on a marble staircase in central Milan, the last Gucci family member to run the company that bore their name died not in a boardroom battle between relatives or in a corporate takeover by outside investors, but in a hired killing orchestrated by his ex-wife. The dynasty that Guccio Gucci had founded in Florence in 1921 as a small leather goods workshop that had survived multiple family feuds and business challenges and changes in fashion across 7 decades, that had evolved into a global luxury brand recognized around the world, lost its final family executive to violence commissioned by someone who had married into the name, but who had never been fully accepted by those born into it, who had spent her marriage trying to prove she deserved the name she carried only through matrimony. For the first time in the Gucci family's history, the name that had opened every door in luxury retail, that had represented Italian craftsmanship and style and elegance across continents, that had been synonymous with prestige and refined taste, became the subject line of a murder investigation file, its meaning transformed overnight from fashion icon to crime story. The glamour that had always surrounded the name became inseparable from the violence that ended Maurizio's life, the luxury brand forever shadowed by the knowledge that one of its own had been killed by someone who wanted not just the money but the name itself, or rather wanted to ensure that the money attached to the name would continue flowing despite the divorce that had severed her direct connection to it. On 31st January 1997, nearly 2 years after the murder, Milan police arrested Patrizia Reggiani based on evidence gathered through the patient, methodical investigation that had eventually traced the killing backward from Cirolo through the network of intermediaries to Oriema, and finally to Patrizia herself as the person who had conceived, financed, and ordered the assassination. The conspiracy had unraveled as conspiracies tend to do when they involve multiple participants with competing interests and vulnerabilities. Cirolo was identified through witness descriptions of the shooter and forensic evidence linking him to the scene. His connections to Oriema were documented through phone records showing frequent contact in the period before the murder and through financial transactions that left traces despite attempts to use cash, and Oriema, facing prosecution and potential life imprisonment, provided detailed testimony implicating Patrizia as the person who had hired and paid for the killing through the intermediary network. The trial that followed, running through much of 1997 and into 1998, became a national spectacle in Italy, receiving the kind of sustained media attention usually reserved for major political scandals or celebrity divorces involving beloved public figures. Court sessions were packed with journalists and spectators, every detail reported extensively in newspapers and on television. The proceedings analyzed by legal experts and fashion industry observers and social commentators who saw in the case larger themes about wealth, marriage, gender, and the corruption that luxury could bring. The international press covered it extensively as well, the story having everything that journalists and their audiences desired: fabulous wealth concentrated in a famous family, extraordinary beauty in the defendant, betrayal and revenge and violence, all wrapped in the glamorous packaging of a globally recognized luxury brand that everyone knew even if they could never afford its products. Cameras captured Patrizia arriving at Milan's Palazzo di Giustizia, the imposing courthouse where her fate would be decided, in proceedings that combined Italian legal procedures with intense public scrutiny. She wore dark suits carefully tailored to project seriousness and dignity, accessorized with large jewelry, gold and substantial gemstones that announced she remained a person of substance despite the criminal charges, and that she refused to present herself as diminished or apologetic. Her presentation in court was curated as carefully as any social appearance had been during her years as Maurizio's wife, still performing a version of herself that the press had christened Lady Gucci, and that she seemed determined to embody even as she faced decades in prison, still insisting through her clothing and on bearing and controlled expression that she belonged to a world of privilege, even as she was tried for its most serious crime. The black gloves she wore against the cold of courthouse steps during breaks in proceedings were no longer evening accessories signaling glamour and social status, but practical items chosen primarily for warmth, though their elegance still served purpose, maintaining dignity while entering and exiting a building where she was defendant rather than honored guest, performing composure under circumstances that denied her control over outcomes, insisting through costume that she remained someone whose appearance mattered even when her freedom was being adjudicated. Trial testimony established the conspiracy through multiple forms of evidence that together created an overwhelming case. Phone records showing contact between participants at key moments, financial transactions documented through bank records and witness accounts of cash payments, and direct testimony from accomplices who described Patrizia's role in conceiving and directing the murder plot. Prosecutors presented the paradeisos diary entry as evidence of premeditation and satisfaction with the outcome, a single word that exposed her state of mind more clearly than any witness testimony could. They emphasized financial motive throughout their case, her fear that Maurizio's remarriage to Paola would reduce her alimony payments, her resentment of Paola for taking what she believed was rightfully hers, her sense that she was entitled to continued access to the lifestyle Maurizio's name had provided, regardless of their divorce. The defense attempted to argue that Patrizia had been manipulated by Auriemma, that the psychic had taken advantage of her vulnerability and pushed her toward actions she would never have contemplated independently. They emphasized the brain tumor surgery she had undergone in 1992, suggesting that the tumor and its treatment had affected her judgment and personality in ways that diminished her criminal responsibility. They portrayed her as a woman driven to desperation by abandonment and financial anxiety, someone who had made terrible decisions but who deserved sympathy rather than the maximum punishment the law allowed. These defense arguments found limited traction with judges and jury who heard the evidence of careful planning and cold calculation that contradicted the image of a confused or manipulated woman acting on impulse. On 3 November 1998, after lengthy deliberations, Patrizia was convicted of arranging the murder and sentenced to 29 years in prison, a term later reduced to 26 years on appeal. Accomplices received varying sentences based on their roles in the conspiracy. Ciraulo and Auriemma received substantial prison terms, while others involved in facilitating or concealing the crime received lesser sentences. The narrator observes that in court, Patrizia maintained elements of the performance she had perfected across decades of social appearances. Poise maintained even under hostile questioning. Careful grooming that never failed, despite the stress of trial. Controlled expression that revealed little of her interior state. But the context had changed completely and irrevocably. The woman who had once curated every photograph of her social appearances, who had controlled her image with such precision, now watched as strangers, prosecutors and judges and defense attorneys and journalists, curated her story, imposing their narratives on her life and reducing her complex history to a character in a morality tale about greed and violence and the corruption that luxury and wealth can bring. In October 2016, after serving 18 years of her sentence in San Vittore and later Beloit prisons outside Milan, Patrizia Reggiani was released on parole, her sentence reduced for good behavior and other factors that Italian law allows to shorten prison terms. Paparazzi photographs captured her walking through Milan streets wearing bright dresses in bold colors, gold jewelry layered at wrists and neck in the style she had always favored, and in several widely circulated images, a brightly colored parrot perched on her shoulder, a flourish that seemed calculated to announce that 18 years of incarceration had not diminished her commitment to spectacle, that she remained someone who demanded attention and who understood public appearance as performance requiring costumes and props. Reports indicated she had secured employment as a consultant for a Milan jewelry firm, her name and notoriety now functioning as a kind of perverse marketing asset, her story transformed into a form of cultural capital that brands could exploit for attention in an age where celebrity scandal attracts customers as effectively as traditional advertising. She remained connected to the luxury world she had always inhabited, but now as curiosity rather than as insider, her position fundamentally altered by her conviction and imprisonment, while her connection to that world was paradoxically deepened by the fame her crime had generated. She gave occasional interviews in which she expressed no remorse for the murder, stating at various times that she had no regrets and that she would rather be viewed as honest about her feelings than perform false contrition for public consumption. Meanwhile, in St. Moritz of Switzerland, Maurizio Gucci's grave lies in a quiet cemetery under alpine snow. His stone marker simple and relatively modest given the global fame of his family name and the enormous wealth the brand represents. Fresh flowers appear regularly, presumably placed by his daughters or by Paola Franchi, who survived him and who carried the memory of their relationship through decades after his violent death. The contrast between the understated memorial and the noise and spectacle surrounding his murder captures something essential about the distance between private tragedy and public entertainment, between the actual loss experienced by people who loved him and the story his death became in media narratives. The Gucci brand itself has not only survived but thrived under corporate ownership that began with Investcorp's purchase of Maurizio's shares and continued through subsequent acquisitions, having passed to LVMH and eventually to Kering, the French luxury conglomerate that currently owns it as part of a portfolio including other prestigious brands. Creative directors appointed by corporate management, Tom Ford in the 1990s rehabilitating the brand's image, and subsequent designers maintaining its relevance through new collections, reference the brand's heritage in advertising campaigns and runway shows. But they rarely mention the family fractures and the murder that marked the end of family control. The double G logo remains one of the world's most recognizable symbols of luxury, appearing on products sold in flagship stores from Milan to New York to Tokyo to Shanghai, its meaning entirely divorced from the people who once owned and operated the company, its heritage carefully curated to emphasize craftsmanship and Italian style, while minimizing the dysfunctional family dynamics that ultimately led to its sale to outside investors. In museums and exhibitions about Italian fashion and luxury brands, display cases sometimes include vintage Gucci pieces from the family era, luggage from the 1950s, handbags from the 1970s, iconic loafers and silk scarves, alongside photographs documenting the company's history and its evolution from Florentine leather workshop to global luxury conglomerate. occasionally in exhibitions specifically about fashion and crime or about famous murders that captured public attention. A pair of black leather gloves, not his specifically, not hers, but representative gloves of the style she favored, and that became symbolically associated with her story, rests under museum glass, a generic symbol of the intersection between elegance and violence, luxury and murder, the way that objects meant to signal refinement can become associated with its opposite. The narrator reflects that Patrizia had declared years before that she would rather cry in a Rolls Royce than be happy on a bicycle, that wealth mattered more to her than emotional contentment, that the setting of one's suffering mattered more than the suffering itself. In the end, after all the plotting and violence and legal proceedings, the Rolls Royces were sold to pay legal fees that consumed whatever remained of her settlement. The Gucci name continued without any family involvement, and indeed prospered under corporate management that brought professional expertise rather than family drama, and the tears she shed, if she shed any, were entirely her own, experienced in prison cells rather than in luxury apartments. The paradise she had written about in her diary revealed as something very different from what she had imagined when she penned that single triumphant word. The gloves that had marked every stage of her journey, from the imaginary gloves she practiced wearing as a teenager in a modest Milan apartment through the evening gloves she wore at her first meeting with Maurizio, from the practical gloves of her years as a corporate wife to the black leather gloves she wore to court during her trial, now exist primarily as motif in her story, symbols of the elegance that was always real in its material form, but hollow in its promise, markers of a refinement that proved compatible with violence, evidence that grace and mercy were entirely separate qualities, and that one could possess the former in abundance while lacking the latter completely.